Okay, this week your chapter is on federalism. And when we look at a federal system of government, you are going to compare it to a unitary system and a confederation. The most common form of structure of government is a unitary system. And what this chapter focuses on is how our government is structured. The fact that we have three separate levels of government, the national, state, and the local level, and that each one of those levels have distinct powers. The national government is responsible for policy that impacts the entire nation. The state is responsible for policies that impact their borders, and the local government is responsible for policies that impact their town or their city. When we start to look at federalism, make sure you understand. Make sure that you look at the arguments also against federalism. Why federalism isn't a good idea? Because there are some negatives about it. Because there are gray areas. There are areas where powers tend to overlap, and this tends to cause problems between most oftentimes the state and the national government. Now, also when we start to look at the powers of the national government and the state government, you will notice that there are distinct powers that are held by both. You will also discover that there are powers that are prohibited both to the state and the national government. And just to give you an idea, a prohibited power for the national government is that they cannot extend titles of nobility. A power that is prohibited to the state governments is that they can't tax imports and exports of goods from foreign countries. Concurrent powers are powers that are held by both the national government and the state government, and you'll discover that the police power is one in your reading, and you'll also discover that when we talk about concurrent powers, taxation is a concurrent power. Federal government taxes you, national government, the state governments also tax you. The Supremacy Clause. Make sure that you look at the Supremacy Clause, because the Supremacy Clause pretty much outlines the idea that anytime a law is created by the state or the local government and it conflicts with an existing law or policy that has been created by the national government, then the national government policy or law should supersede the state government. And this is one of those interesting areas when we start looking at the use of marijuana in terms of being recreational. Because technically the federal government still sees it as being something that's outlawed and illegal, and some states have already passed the recreational use of marijuana. Again, one of those gray areas. Then when we look at interstate relations, the relationships between the states, how they interact with one another. Now, one of the big cases that they talk about McCulloch versus Maryland. They talk about Gibson versus Ogden. What I want you to focus on in terms of McCulloch versus Maryland, this is a huge case. The reason why it's so important is because it helps to define the necessary and proper clause and what it means. Because in McCulloch versus Maryland, McCulloch worked for a national bank that was located in Maryland. McCulloch decided that they were not going to pay the state taxes that Maryland had set on the national bank. And the argument is that based upon the necessary and proper clause, although the federal government didn't have the ability to establish a national bank, it wasn't written necessarily into the Constitution. It was necessary because we needed to establish some type of monetary system in the U.S., and it was proper because it fell within their boundaries of regulation. This is important because it's going to expand the power of the national government to be able to do things that, although is not specifically written into the Constitution, it is implied by the existence of other powers. Make sure that you look at federalism and the different types of federalism. Dual federalism is how we start out. Federal government and state government see each other as different entities, and one doesn't cross over into the other. When we get to cooperative federalism, it comes about during the New Deal era with FDR, and what you'll discover is that this is the introduction of the current welfare system. But what you'll also discover is that the welfare system that was created by FDR his argument was is that it was created out of need. It was only supposed to be temporary, and once they made it through the Great Depression, all of those programs were supposed to go away, but they didn't. Make sure you read about the devolution, how what has changed in terms of politics. Now the national government is trying to give more power back to the states, and the way they're trying to do this is actually through how they give money to the states in terms of categorical grants, in terms of block grants. Make sure you know the difference between those, because the way the federal government gives money to the states is important. Also, be familiar with federal mandates. So these are a couple of things that you need to make sure that you look at in the chapter, and I think you'll find interesting. Again, if you have any questions about information in the chapter, by all means, please feel free to email me.